Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the grid pane. Now, a grid pane is actually very similar to the flow panes we've talked about. The only difference is, instead of having a default orientation, because of the way a grid pane works, it's a two-dimensional grid, or a matrix almost, there obviously won't be any sort of orientation. You just specify the index you'd like to add something at. Whereas with our flow panes, you had to provide your orientation you'd like to fill in. For a grid pane, instead of having the orientation data field, you have the grid lines visible data field, which is a Boolean property. This allows us to check if the grid line is visible or not. The default is false. So let's get started with the grid pane's class diagram. It has four data fields: alignment, which is an object property; grid lines visible, which as we mentioned is a Boolean property; hgap and vgap, both of which are double properties. Now they all do what they sound like. It has one constructor, or one main constructor, that we'll be using, which is the default constructor. No arguments, it just creates a basic grid pane. Then it has the add method, which adds a specific node at the specific column index, row index. That's a void return type. Then it has the add column, which adds multiple nodes to the specified column. And then we have the add row, which adds multiple nodes to the specified row. After that, we also have the get column index, which returns the column index for the specified node. And we have the set column index, which moves that node to a new column. Therefore, the method repositions that node. Then we have the corresponding get row index and set row index, which do the same thing except with the row. And then we have the set h alignment and set v alignment, which sets the vertical and horizontal alignments for the child in the cell. So let's try this out. Now that we've actually tried the grid pane, we've tried the flow pane with this program, let's say we want to try it out with a grid pane, where every single time we always want to make sure that there was always the first name, then a return, middle initial, then a return, and then the last name, followed by a return, and then a add name button. This button wouldn't be wired to anything, but we're going to have it anyways. So let's get started. To do this, the first thing we're going to need to do is add in some new imports. We're going to need to add in the appropriate button input, or import. We're going to import that from the JavaFX.scene.control.button. After that, we're going to import the JavaFX.scene.layout.gridPane. And then we're going to import two new geometry objects, those being the JavaFX.geometry.hPosition, or hpos, and then we're going to be importing the JavaFX.geometry.position. Now the reason we have these is so that we can properly implement the vertical position and the horizontal position methods, or the v-alignment and h-alignment methods. You'll see why in a little bit. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to create a new stage. We're going to preserve all of our old pane types so that we can see the differences. So we're going to create a new grid pane, and this grid pane we're going to call pane 1 is equal to a new grid pane. After that, we should make sure that we properly create a new stage. We should create the stage as soon as possible so that we don't try to add in some nodes to a non-existent stage. So we're going to say stage, and we'll call this stage 1 is equal to a new stage. And with that, we've now created the proper stage and the pane. So let's get started with aligning the pane the pane 1 that we've created. We're going to say pane1.setAlignment, and then we're going to provide the plus center. Now what this says, and this is the reason we had to import in the position class file, what this says is that we want to align everything to the center of the window, so that if you were to find the middle index of your two-dimensional grid, if you were to find the middle value, that would give you it would be automatically set to the center, so that the center of the grid and the center of our window correspond. This is the only way we can make sure that we have a properly implemented grid for window size. Otherwise, you'd run into issues just like we did with the button, where when you resize the window, the center of the grid wouldn't correspondingly change. After that, we can now set the padding, just like we did for the original pane. And we can provide any sort of padding here. We're going to say our padding is going to be 11.5, 12.5, 13.5, and 14.5. So we just have to add those in. So first we have 11.5, followed by 12.5, followed by 13.5, followed by 14.5. And with that, we've now set our padding properly, as long as we make sure we put this into a new insets. As remember, this was essential to the way that this works. You have to create a new inset object so that the spacing is proper. After that, we can now set a new hgap and vgap. We're going to again change our hgap and vgap slightly. This time, instead of being 5, it's going to be 5.5 and 5.5 for the vgap as well. So all we have to do is just change this to 5.5, and we can copy paste this since it's going to be almost the same thing for the vgap. With that, we've now done all the preparation before we can start adding in the appropriate labels and buttons. Now, the good way to think of this would be to think about a grid. Think about a grid with 3 by 3 spaces. This is similar to what we're going to be working with. Remember, every single grid in Java is based on a 0 index. So when I say 3 by 3, I'm saying it's actually 4 spaces by 4 spaces long. The way we want this to work is we want the first name label. And if we run our program, I'm actually going to run the old program so you can see what I'm talking about. Our goal is to make sure that the first name is going to be indicated on the 0, 0, because we want that to be first. After that, right next to it, we want the text field. Since it reads horizontal then vertical, we have to put the text field at 1, 0. Then we have to put the label, middle initial, at 0, 1. Since that's going to be on the same line or the same vertical plane as the label for the first name, but this time a column or a row down. Then we have to add the text field at 1, 1 because it has to be on the same line, followed by a final label at 0, 2 because just like before, the labels have to be horizontal or vertically aligned. Then we have to add the text field at 1, 2 because that'll allow us to make sure the text field is right next to the last name label. And finally, we need to add the new button. That new button is going to be at the indice 1, 3 because you want the button to be, if you were thinking about it in a grid, it shouldn't be on the same level as the first name, last name, middle initial, but it shouldn't be at the same line as the last name either. So you're going to put it at 1, 3 so that it's at the same vertical plane as the text fields we have, but this time it's going to be 1 column down, or one row down. And since the button is smaller, it's going to be we want to align it to the right side, again, so that we make sure we distinguish between a button and a text field and a label. So let's get started. What we're going to do is we're going to say pane1.add. Now remember, this .add allows us to add in any sort of value we'd like at any indice we'd like as well. So we're going to say we want to add in a new label. This is an anonymous label. And remember, you have to specify where you want this label because by default there is no location. So you have to give your indices. We're going to say this label should say first name, but then we want it to be at the indice 0, 0. So the way to distinguish this and the way that this method works is your node that you'd like to add in this case a label object, and the indice, in this case 0, 0. Similarly, we're going to do this for the text field, and we're going to be doing a lot of copy pasting today since pane.add is a very repetitive piece of code. We can actually make sure we can just copy paste that most of the time. We're going to add a text field this time, and we're going to inside the text field we're not going to have any parameters, but then we want to make sure that this is at the appropriate indice, which was 1, 0. Then we have to add a new label, except this time it's going to say middle initial, not first name. And then we're going to place this at the indice 0, 1. Then we're going to add the new text field, which will be for the middle initial to be entered. And that will be right next to the mi, which will be at 1, 1. And then we can put in our last name, which will be a label again. We'll just say last name. And this will be at the indice 0, 2, because once again, it should be a row down. After that, we can add the final text field, which will be a text field that will be for the last name. No parameters on the method. And that will be placed at 1, 2 for what I hope are obvious reasons at this point. And finally, we're going to create a new button. Now we're actually going to make sure we create this button with a object reference variable. We're going to call it BT add, because we need to be able to reference this button since we need to modify its arguments, and we need to add this button to the pane later on. But it's not strictly speaking necessary, but because we're creating a button with a specified value, we're going to create a separate button, especially because the button object is very different to the label and text field objects that we've been creating up here. Inside the button, we want it to say add name. After that, we can now add this button to the specified indice, where we'll say pane1.add, and then we'll provide the appropriate value, which will be the button, and that's called BT add at the specified indice, which is going to be 1, 3, as I mentioned previously, and then we're going to have to align that button to the right side. So we're going to say grid pane dot set h alignment, and this is really why we have to declare it as a separate object. If you didn't want to align it, you wouldn't have to do this. The child is going to be the BT add button, and the value is going to be hpos, or h position, dot right, which just says we want this button to be right aligned to the window. After that, we can now create a new scene. Just like before, this is going to be very similar to what we did up here. In fact, we can actually copy paste it, just change the appropriate variables. This will now become scene 1, and we'll make this pane 1. We'll change the title from show flow pane to show grid pane, and we'll change the appropriate stage from primary stage to stage 1 that we created up here. And then we'll appropriately change the stage 1 here, and we'll make this stage 1 as well. And then we'll set the scene appropriately, and we'll just change this from scene to, in this case, scene 1. And with that, we can now run our program to see the advantage of the grid pane. So if you look at this, first we have our normal flow pane, where it depends on the size of the window, because it's not very polished actually, since it looks quite ugly to see the middle initial appear and the last name right next to the text field. It only looks proper if you resize the window, and in which case you still have to fiddle around with it so that you get it right. Even so, you're almost always going to have the last name on the same line as the middle initial. Compare that to the grid pane, where it looks extremely well done, since everything is going to be perfectly aligned. Even if we expand out the window, it still looks perfectly aligned, and if we make the window vertically taller, it still looks perfectly aligned, where the first name, middle initial, and last name are all right next to each other vertically, and the text fields are all lined up. Then the add name button is right aligned. In addition, because of the way a pane works, it's not like when we said the button should be right aligned, the button didn't go all the way over here. The button intelligently was still at the same level as the text fields, making it not look too offset. Now that we've talked about a grid pane, we can talk about a border pane. To use the border pane, we're actually not going to be displaying any sort of names. For demonstrating the border pane, we're going to be demonstrating how each of the regions can work. So to do that, we're going to make sure we have the appropriate import statements. Now the import statements are actually going to be very similar. The only new thing we have to import in this case is going to be the appropriate layout, in this case the border pane. And if you're wondering what the border pane is very similar to the other panes we've talked about. However, the border pane has 5 regions. It has the top, then it has the bottom, then it has the middle or center, and then the right and left. You can add specific nodes to each of these regions, and therefore you can align your nodes properly to the specific situation you're working with. In our case, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be demonstrating how each of those regions works. And once we've properly imported it, after that we can now get started on talking about the way the border pane class is designed. Now, unlike the previous ones, we actually don't have any sort of alignment or anything like that, because everything is going to be placed in the appropriate position. All we have is 5 new data fields. each of these data fields are object property values. They are the top, right, bottom, left, and center. These are just for nodes placed in the top, right, center, and bottom regions, and by default they are null values. These are all object properties, so they can be bound to. Then we have a default border pane constructor and a set alignment that allows us to set the alignment of the node in the border pane. For example, you could set your alignment to the so that you want it to be left aligned or right aligned. In our case, we're not going to be modifying the alignment in any way. So the way we're going to do this is actually we're going to create a custom class today. We're actually going to create this custom class inside the same Eclipse class file. Since there's no public class in this case, it's just going to extend the stack pane class. Because, and you'll see why, it's because we want to create an implementation of the border pane class that allows us to display each of these values with specific labels and with specified colors. You don't need to do this, but we're doing it so we can cut down repetitive code. So, we're actually going to first create that custom class. It's going to be a class custom pane. It will extend the stack pane class, and you'll see why. Then inside the class, we need to create a public custom pane class, or method. This public custom pane method will take a string title parameter. Then inside it, we just have to say get children. And remember, this is an instance method, so the getting children is happening on the instance that called this method. And then, just like before, we need to add the new label. However, this time the label is just going to be the title that the calling method passes to us. After that, we can now start setting the style. Now, in this case, the reason we're doing this in a custom class, as I mentioned, is for reusability, but it's also so that we have standards. We want to make sure that the padding for every single value is the same, and so that the border color is always the same again. To set the border color, we're actually going to use the JavaFX CSS that we've talked about. Inside a string, we have to make sure we say -fx border color, and those are two separate words, so they're separated by hyphens again, colon, red. Then we have to close our string, and then we have to have our semicolon. Now this means that every single time we put in a new value or a new title, it'll always have the appropriate red color lines around it. And then we can put in new insets so that we have the appropriate padding. This is so that every single value is appropriately padded from its edges. So we're going to say set padding, and then we're going to provide new insets of 11.5, 12.5, 13.5, and 14.5. This is similar to the previous insets we used in the grid pane object. Hopefully you see why we extended the stack pane class. It's so that we could use the get children, set style, and set padding methods, otherwise we wouldn't be able to. So, now that we've created our custom class, we can get started on creating a new border pane object inside the original class. However, remember that we're actually going to have to slightly modify this since we need to create new stages, since we're creating a new window for this border pane object. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create a new stage, and we'll call this stage 2 is equal to a new stage. After that, we can now create our border pane object. This border pane we're going to call, for example, pane 1 or pane 2. It'll be equal to a new border pane because we're not going to provide any arguments. We need a default border pane. After that, we can now start to think about how we want to implement this border pane. We want to have 5 new regions. Each of these regions is going to create a new custom pane, and each of these custom panes is going to have to be set to the appropriate area with the appropriate title. Then it's going to be fairly standard, but the way we're going to do this is using some methods that are defined in the border pane class. These are instance methods, by the way. You would say pane.setTop. This setTop method, this setTop method allows us to create a new, or to set a new node at the top of the box. Remember, there are 5 regions. By saying setTop, we're creating a new node at the top of the pane. So we're going to say setTop new custom pane, which you'll recall that we created down here, and then we'll pass the appropriate argument for a title, which will just say top, so it'll be appropriately labeled. Then we can actually copy paste this. It's going to be fairly similar for the remaining 4 regions. Instead of saying set top, we're going to say set right. Instead of saying set top, we're going to change this to set bottom. And this is going to be set left. And then finally, we're going to have set center, because those are our 5 regions. Then we'll change our titles so that they line up to right, bottom, left, and center. As a quick side note, in general, if you are creating pane objects, or if you're creating anything that has regions, you should always work clockwise from the top around. This is the way that Java works, and therefore, you should make your code, as we mentioned in the past, line up with the Java convention. So always work from the top to the right, to the bottom, to the left, and then to the center. The center should always be last if you have 5 objects, or if you have 5 regions. After that, we can create a, it becomes fairly standard, we have to create a new scene. We're going to call this scene 2 is equal to a new scene with the parameter of the pane, in this case pane 2, that has all of our appropriate regions. Then we have to create the set title for the stage, so we're going to say stage2.setTitle, and then we're going to provide the title. In this case, it's going to be show border pane. After that, we now have to set the scene, so we're going to say stage2.setScene with the value of the scene we've created. And finally, we have to display the stage, so we're going to say stage2.show. Fairly standard there. So to summarize, what we did here was we created our own custom class. This custom class was the custom pane class. It extended the stack pane class and allowed us to have standardized ways of creating a pane with the same labels, the same border colors, and the same padding, and to cut down the amount of repetitive code, since we just created 5 new panes, set them to the 5 new nodes of the custom pane type, set them to the appropriate regions in our border pane object that we created up here, and then we display that border pane object. So if we run our program, you can now see the difference between our 3 programs. If we split them up, first we had our original flow pane, where it's not very well aligned, but it still has everything. Then we have our grid pane, where it displays everything in an orderly fashion. But then we have our more interesting and more a little bit, I guess, out there implementation of the border pane. The border pane, as you can see, has a top, left, bottom, right, and center. The top and bottom get precedence over the left and right because the left and right have to share the same space with the center. However, you'll notice as if we maximize it, the center is by far the biggest object. The center is only the same size as the left and right because of the way that program was created, but by default, the top, left, bottom, and right should be the same size, and the center should take up the majority of the area. This is why we padded it appropriately. So if you are working with the border pane object, you should always know that the center will usually be the largest node that you're working with. Hopefully you found this lesson useful. In the interest of time, we're going to end this lesson here. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking about the HBox and VBox. To summarize, in today's lesson, we talked about the grid pane and the border pane classes, and we talked about a good implementation of each of them.